Let's begin by giving you an introduction to the museum and the Hall of Fame. Here you can see this is the three-story red brick building that I'm broadcasting from. I'm actually in the back of the building in the library. We have 3 floors of exhibits. We have 2 theaters. We have an amazing collection of about 40,000 baseball-related artifacts. And we're going to be looking at some of those artifacts a bit more closely today. Here are some black and white photographs from when we got started. June 12th, 1939, that was our grand opening ceremony here at the Hall of Fame. We had a ribbon cutting ceremony. We had our first induction as well. Players like Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb officially became members of the Hall of Fame. Inside the Hall of Fame, we have a plaque gallery. This is where we feature the bronze plaques for each of the 306 members of the Hall of Fame. These are the greatest players, managers, umpires, executives that baseball has ever seen. 3 of the more famous plaques belong to these men. In the middle is Ernie Banks. Sadly, he just passed away back in February, one of our more popular Hall of Fame members. He actually started his career in segregated baseball. He played in the Negro Leagues for a team called the Kansas City Monarchs, before eventually being signed by the Chicago Cubs. On the left, you have Hank Aaron. He also started his professional career in Negro Leagues baseball. He played for a team that was actually called the Indianapolis Clowns. From there, he joined the Milwaukee Braves. And then on the right, you see Babe Ruth. That's the man whom Hank Aaron surpassed for the home run record. Babe Ruth, the original home run king of baseball, but Aaron did. Let's look at this sketch, a drawing from 1865. It shows what early baseball looked like. I'd like you all to take a look at the field, take a look at the players. What differences do you notice between baseball in 1865 compared to the game today? Anybody see any differences?
Raise your hand if you guys see any differences. Josiah, go ahead. And then Brooke. Say it out loud.
There's no umpire.
Louder, louder. Louder.
There's no umpire.
Actually, there is an umpire. He's just dressed differently. Look to the right of the catcher, a few feet away. The gentleman with a long coat, that's actually the umpire. But he does have a different uniform than umpires today. Other exhibits here at the Hall of Fame, we have Diamond Dreams about women in baseball. Girls and women have been playing baseball since the 1860s, almost as long as men have been playing. In this exhibit, we learn about early women's teams, the Bloomer Girls. We also learn about the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, which sprang up during World War II, and more recent teams like the Colorado Silver Bullets. So this is a very popular exhibit. And then finally, we have Pride and Passion, an exhibit about African Americans and their connection to the game. We learn about baseball when it was a segregated sport. We learn about the birth and development of the Negro Leagues. We also find out about Jackie Robinson in this exhibit. You can see there is Jackie's Brooklyn Dodger cap in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And that brings us to our program today, Civil Rights Before You Could Say Jackie Robinson. Today, we're going to explore the history of African American players by looking at some objects and artifacts from various time periods. These artifacts can be used to gather historical information about the time period in which they were used or made. Now, we talk about baseball as the national pastime, a game that developed here, became popular here. It is our oldest professional sport. At its best, it's a game that's supposed to reflect American values like fairness and honesty. But there have been times when baseball has not done that. There have been times when it's reflected bad racial attitudes. And there have been times when the game has not proved very fair. Now, behind me, you can see a large image, a postage stamp that's been blown up. It's an image of Jackie Robinson. He's commonly thought of as the first African American to play Major League Baseball, but that's really not the case. Research tells us that African American players were playing the game as early as the 1860s, decades before Jackie was even born. One of those early players we see here, Bud Fowler. Bud Fowler was actually the first African American to play professional baseball. He didn't play in the major leagues. He played lower level minor league ball, but he was the first to play the professional game. And here you can see he's an African-American man on a team with white players. We have an integrated team. Other players. Here's a photograph that not only has Bud Fowler, but also Grant Home Run Johnson, seen on the left. And you can see their white teammate, an integrated team, Findlay, Ohio. And then we have this man, Moses Fleetwood Walker. It actually was Walker who was the first black to play Major League Baseball, long before Jackie Robinson. So if these guys came before Jackie, why is it that Walker and Fowler and Johnson are not as well known as Jackie Robinson? They're not household names. Why is that? What do you think?
Go ahead, Will.
Because of the time Jackie Robinson was there, right?
Okay.
Say it again, please.
Because of the time Jackie played?
Well, it had to do with the time that Jackie played, absolutely. Jackie played in the 40s and 50s. Baseball was soaring in popularity, and there was a lot of media coverage. You had radio, television, newspaper. When Fowler and Walker played, there was no radio, there was no television coverage, not yet invented. There was only newspaper coverage. And the game was popular, but not as popular as it would become in New York City in the 40s and 50s. So that's part of the equation. What else do you think is going on here? Why is it that Walker and Fowler are not as well known?
Go ahead, Desaya. Go ahead, take a guess. Aaron, go ahead.
Because of the racism and stuff?
A little louder.
Because of the racism and stuff?
Okay, Robinson, he has to deal with overt racism. There was a color barrier, a color line put into effect. Robinson is the first man to break that color barrier. So there's a conflict there. It creates a story. And this drew a lot of attention. When Walker and Fowler played, there was no color barrier. Moses Fleetwood Walker, the first one to play in the major leagues. 1884, Walker, seen with his Toledo Blue Stockings teammates. Toledo joins the American Association. At the time, the American Association was considered a major league. Now, some of Toledo's opponents did not want to play against a team with a black man. They threatened to cancel their games. How do you think the Blue Stockings management responded? Did they support Walker, or did they react differently? What do you think?
Will?
I don't think they supported it.
He doesn't think they supported it, Bruce.
You're right. So what do you think they did to him? What do you think they did to Walker?
Go ahead, Ashley, say it again.
They probably didn't let him play with teams like that.
Yeah, they didn't let him play at all. In fact, they released him from the team. Now, he was a really good catcher, smart player, respected by his teammates. They just got rid of him. They released him. Soon after, other teams did the same thing as the Blue Stockings. They released their black players. They didn't want to have games canceled, and they didn't want to lose money. So they said, we're not even going to bother. So they got rid of their black players too. By 1887, all the major league and minor league teams have gotten together. They made a gentleman's agreement, a secret agreement not to sign African-American players. This is the start of the color barrier. And it would remain from 1887 until 1947. Now, what's going on in baseball is no different from what's going on in the rest of American society. Because after the Civil War, many states start to adopt the so-called Jim Crow laws, which establish racial segregation throughout the United States. Basically, what happened is from the 1880s through the 1960s, states adopt the Jim Crow laws. These laws ordered businesses and public places like schools and hospitals to keep their black and white customers separated. And in 1896, we have a famous U.S. Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which rules that segregation by law is legal. So it basically confirms the Jim Crow law. Let's read some examples of these laws. We have one for the state of South Carolina. Could I have a volunteer from the class read this one?
Go ahead, Bryce.
No person shall furnish meals to white and colored persons in the same room or at the same table or at the same counter.
Okay, very good. What kind of places are we talking about here?
A restaurant.
Public restaurants, diners, cafes. They must keep their clientele, black and white, separated. Here's an example. Look at the two restaurants. Farmer's Cafe on the left is for white customers. Quick Lunch on the right is for colored. Not a term we use today, but at the time it was a term used to describe African. And not only do Jim Crow laws affect people based on skin color, it affects people based on their heritage. Here's a sign: we serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. So if you came from south of the border, if you're Latino in this particular restaurant, not allowed to eat there. Can somebody read the Jim Crow law for the state of Mississippi?
Josh.
Separate schools shall be maintained for the children of whites and colored races.
All right, very controversial. Very strong feelings on both sides of the issue. Segregation of public schools. Some people protested in favor of segregation. Look at the young men in the upper right-hand corner. They claim we won't go to school with Negroes. Again, a term we don't use today, but it was used at the time. Against them, you have people in the bottom of your screen. We're protesting school segregation. Don't treat our children like prisoners. We have another example. I'll read this one. The officer in charge shall not bury or allow to be buried any colored persons upon grounds set apart or used for the burial of white persons. So we're talking about graveyards, cemeteries. It's not enough to segregate blacks and whites in the living world. We have to keep them separate after they've died. Segregated burial grounds, again, shows you the extent by which the Jim Crow laws were followed and promoted. Now, some of the defenders of the Jim Crow laws said, yeah, we're separating blacks and whites, but we're creating equal conditions. Blacks have just as good a deal as the whites do. Well, we're going to illustrate that's really not the case. Look at the two water fountains. We have the one on the left labeled white. We have the one on the right labeled colored. Now, forget for a moment the signs above the water fountains. If I asked you, which of these two would you rather drink from? Which would you pick?
Which one?
One on the left.
Okay, why the one on the left? Why do you like that one?
It's nicer. Clean.
Okay, it's nicer, it's cleaner, it's newer, it's more appetizing. The one on the right is old and rusty and stained. That gentleman there, if he puts too much pressure on that water fountain, might fall right off the wall. Does not look very appetizing. Are these equal conditions? No, not at all. Clearly, white citizens have better conditions than black citizens. This is just one example. So baseball is no different. Black players are excluded from white professional leagues. They have no choice but to form their own teams. Here we have the first all-black professional team, the Cuban Giants, organized in 1885. Now, this is interesting. They called themselves Cuban Giants, but they were not from Cuba. They were African American. They only pretended to be Cuban. They pretended to speak Spanish. Why would they do that? Why would they put on such a charade?
Why do you think they do that? Go ahead, Alex.
So they can play.
Okay, so they can play. Why do you think they would be more likely to play if people thought they were Cuban and not African American?
Cubans are more kind of accepted at that time than black people were.
Yeah, that's right. Foreigners are more accepted in the late 1800s in general than African Americans. So these players thought if we pretend to be Cuban, if we pretend to speak Spanish, we'll get a better deal. More teams will be more likely to play us. We'll get better treated by the fans. That's how rough it was for African American citizens in the 1880s and 1890s in particular. Now, one of the people that wanted to change what was going on in baseball was this man, Andrew Rube Foster. He had been a player, a manager, and an owner of a team, the Chicago American Giants. He convinced 7 other Midwestern team owners to join him in forming the Negro National League. Now, Rube Foster was a very smart guy, great businessman, great visionary. He convinces 7 other Midwestern team owners to join him in forming this league. It's very well organized. It's basically an opportunity for the best black players to play the game at the highest level. And Foster was a great businessman. He really got Negro Leagues baseball started. He's living in Chicago, so that's where he bases the league headquarters. And he puts teams in the Midwest, states like Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Well, Negro Leagues baseball takes off. It spreads to the East Coast. We start to see teams, places like Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City. And then eventually Negro Leagues baseball goes into the South as well. States like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. So Negro Leagues baseball thrives in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It becomes a major industry. It becomes very, very successful. Great teams and great players emerge. Here's one of the greatest teams ever, the 1935 Pittsburgh Crawfords. They had 5 Hall of Famers on their roster: Oscar Charleston, Cool Papa Bell, Judy Johnson, Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige. Not only did they win the Negro Leagues championship in 1935, but many historians think if they had had a chance to play in the major leagues that year, they might have won the World Series too.